On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Shang Wang. He is the co-founder and CTO at CentML. We're going to be talking about open source technologies and how the enterprise is going to be working with that ecosystem, especially when we're talking about AI. We're going to talk to Shang about what that means in practice. We're going to talk a little bit about where CentML fits within that open source ecosystem. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how enterprise mindset might be shifting towards open source. We're going to try to cover as much as we can. We only have a limited time, but Shang, thanks for taking the time for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So before we start, why don't you tell everyone what CentML does?
Sure. So CentML, we build software tools and the infrastructure for ML developers, ML researchers, and data scientists alike, so that they can develop models, train models, and deploy models in a very performance and cost-efficient manner.
All right. So let's actually start off. So traditionally, most enterprises didn't go open source, right? They like solutions and backed by companies. I mean, we've seen a couple that have worked out really well, such as like a Red Hat and other data tools as well. I want to ask you: are we seeing, when it comes to AI, are we seeing potentially a shift in how enterprises view open source?
I would say so. I think AI development has been primarily kind of open source from the get-go. Like before kind of the 2017 era, most of the people who develop AI models, they are like, mainly academia and then also some from industrial research labs. And those people, like academia, like they write some code, they publish papers, they make the code open source, and other people can build like derivative works or like experiments, other things based on the code that people has written in their prior works. I think because AI started with like a very strong open source community, when AI application hits enterprise, it was kind of like like open source is like where kind of people start with. I mean, if you ask me, I would say kind of closed source will be actually the anomaly in this bigger like landscape, in the sense that the anomaly is essentially OpenAI and then Anthropic, and then pretty much like that's it. So there are like two different type of users, right? Like if you want to use OpenAI services kind of like as a black box, and then you use OpenAI, and like you have to be comfortable with the fact that OpenAI models are closed source, whereas like if you're kind of like a developer working like in certain enterprises working on applications, you will probably want a lot more transparency on the model itself, and then you would like naturally gravitate towards like open source AI solutions.
I guess if you're an enterprise, and it does make sense, a lot of AI is open source. If you're an enterprise and you're trying to factor that and you're trying to build with that open source component, is there something that you have to do differently, or is your development methodology, has anything changed or shift at all?
So whether or not the framework or the library you're using is closed source or open source doesn't matter that much in terms of how you would develop an application. However, most closed source solutions, they are packaged more kind of like in a black box kind of way, whereas like you have a set of interfaces, but then beyond the interface you have no idea what's happening under. I mean, you could like speculate what's happening underneath, but like you have no idea what's happening underneath. Whereas if you were to use an open source solution, and then you write some code, and then suddenly like a bug appear, you would be able to actually like dig into the source code trying to figure out what the problem actually is. And the power of like open source community is that you can actually contribute the fix of the problem like back to the, like for example, like the repo that hosts the open source projects, so that like essentially your contribution will be more visible like in that particular community. Good for like brand buildings and all of that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that definitely makes sense. I guess when it comes to people who are working with open source, it sounds like the ecosystem of people that have the opportunity to work with those open source tools should be bigger than if it's closed source, because obviously you might have to own licenses and everything. Does that help companies as they're kind of going down the path of looking for these type of AI talents, people who are potentially picking this stuff up just earlier in their career?
For sure, for sure. So I think, like every engineers or developers who are working was like a students, once, in their life back when they were like doing their underground programs and whatnot. And then when they were like a students and they want to build like side projects or cross projects, they probably would start with like open source solution to begin with. Now, strictly speaking, open source doesn't equal free software, but then in practice, a lot of open source are free software. And students doesn't have money, so that's where they start with. And then as they kind of like go through their undergrad program, they accumulate more and more experience and knowledge on the particular like open source tools or frameworks or libraries that they have been using in the past. And once like a particular company hires them, like they wouldn't, necessarily have to train them like from scratch as if they had like no experience before. So I think like a very good kind of concrete example would be, say, for example, PyTorch is like open source ML framework that a lot of undergrads students build like side project with. And if Meta wants to hire, Meta hire a lot of like new grads every year, but like those new grads, Meta doesn't have to like explain to them like what PyTorch is kind of like from scratch and like have them like learn a new framework from scratch. Meta is who maintain kind of the PyTorch project.
You mentioned obviously a lot of AI originated with open source. I guess if you were to look at, the roadmap and where technology is going along the AI maturity curve, is the ecosystem going to keep expanding? Do you think that's the path? Do you think companies are going to be like, hey, listen, we actually have opportunities to build more proprietary solutions? Or is the nature of the tool going to kind of just be an expansion in that ecosystem of open source?
I would say the expansion will be primarily like in the open source realm. I think there will still be companies who try to build proprietary solutions in-house, depending on like their specific situations. But I think as a general trend, like the AI community, the open source part of it is like expanding over the years. I think, like just to kind of like look at, recent developments kind of in the recent AI history, we started with, back in 2012 was like when, AlexNet came out, and then, the researchers who were working on AlexNet were like writing kind of like C programs and CUDA programs in order to like implement like the training scripts and like the inference scripts. But then, as we kind of like move towards around like 2015 or ish is when there are a lot of like ML frameworks who were also open source came out that allow people to like write GPU program without having to write CUDA or C themselves, which is what's kind of like prompt a big explosion in terms of the number of like ML developers like in the world. And then as we kind of like then move to the more recent history, back in 2017, 2018 is like when Transformer came out, which was also again open source, and then afterwards it was like GPT-1, GPT-2, which was open source. OpenAI was taking the company to a different direction, which is like a different story. But then, other than that, like in even more recent years, like DeepSpeak come out, which has really good performance, even compared to like OpenAI, which actually kind of like put a lot of pressures on OpenAI, kind of making more and more details about their models to be public.
Yeah, obviously as you're kind of going through that, it does sound like you did mention the ecosystem start open source and staying open source is the likelihood. I guess when we're looking at what you guys do at CentML, and obviously I'd like to kind of have the audience hear a little bit more depth about what the product does, because I know there's potential advantages to a product like yours when it comes to some of the open source deployments and whatnot. So could you tell us a little bit about what CentML does, and then also, if you could, where that integration to that open source world goes?
For sure, yeah. So I think it would be probably very helpful, maybe for me to kind of explain what would happen behind the curtain of like model endpoints, such as, for example, the ChatGPT one, and then I'll kind of like use that as an anchor point to explain, right, like which parts we're using or like contributing or adopting open source solutions and how we're integrated into that community. So I think the first thing, I mean, if you want to build like a model endpoint, right, like the first thing you will need is a implementation of the model itself. So that part is what we call like an inference engine. Well, we were building a fully in-house solution from the get-go, which was what we called like Caesar V1. However, as we kind of like progress, we quickly noticed that if we want to build something completely in-house from scratch, like there are a lot of features that different people are asking for, and if we were to build every single of those features, like that would be too time consuming. I mean, like we're a startup, we're not a big company who has like 100 people on like a single project or something. Around the similar time when we were experiencing this pain point is when a open source project called VLM came out, like was released, which initially was a research artifact from a research paper called Page Attention. So it was a research artifact initially, but then afterwards, a lot of kind of people pick it up and then start to kind of like contributing feature backs, and it grew to be like a pretty big open source community very rapidly. So basically, like in the V2 of Caesar, what we eventually decided is that we ditch like a good chunk of the old kind of from scratch implementation we had, and then we base the other parts on top of VLM, like in the sense that we would use VLM as a library and a lot of the features that they already have, we will leverage, and then we would add and contribute feature back to VLMs on the things that like our customer needs. So specifically, like two big features that we contributed back to VLM. One was pipeline parallel inference. So if you want to deploy like a gigantic model such as 4.5, like Llama 3.1 4.5 billion model, that occupies like almost like a trillion, like 1 terabyte of GPU memory alone. And like there's no GPU on the world that like can fit that big of a model. So in order to like make it work, you have to like slice the model by layers, and you have to put different layers of the model into different GPU. In a sense, you can think of it as forming different GPUs into a pipeline where the inputs, the data are passing through each GPU one by one. And in order to make the whole thing efficient, like essentially, we need to make sure that while one GPU is processing some data, all the other GPUs, they are like processing either like the previous data or the next data, so that all the GPUs, they are like utilized at the same time. So that is pipeline parallel inference, which was we had a customer who wanted to deploy like a model of that scale, and then that is like a feature we initially implemented ourselves, but then afterwards we contributed back to VLMs. Another big feature we contributed back was speculative sampling for DeepSeek R1. So DeepSeek is yet again another like gigantic model, like 470 like billion parameters or something. For that model to process a single sample by itself is going to take some time. It's a little bit slow. So in order to make it not as slow, we like essentially use a technique called speculative decoding or sampling, which essentially uses a smaller model, what we call a draft model, to do the one token at a time prediction. But then after the draft model predicts like a few tokens, we would then send like a collection of tokens back to the bigger models for the bigger models to verify. So in a sense, like we're hedging kind of the long latency from the big model with the shorter latency from the small model, and but like overall, we still kind of keep the output to be exactly the same as the big model before. So those are kind of the two big features we contributed back to VLM. So that's kind of the model implementation parts, and then each model has to run on one or several GPUs, and then a model is essentially a collection of mathematical operations. So we need to make sure that each mathematical operation has the best GPU like CUDA implementation of them. So this is where like a compiler comes in, and this is where we are kind of like a builder of a open source project, and we're kind of the main maintainer of an open source project. So we have an ML compiler called HiDAT, which essentially takes in a model represented in like a graph of mathematical operation formats, and then we would for example, fuse certain operations together, or find better operations, implementation of the operations depending on the specific GPU that the user is using. So like a trivial way to think about this is like if you think about the inference engine as the car, and then compiler would be the engine of the car, and then the engine is essentially the determining factor of how fast the car can run. So we built HiDAT from scratch, and then we made it open source, and then we are like currently the main maintainer of that project. So once you have the model implementation and make sure it's optimized, you have to run it somewhere, right? Like can't run out of a vacuum. So this is why people will need like a compute infrastructure, and our compute infrastructure are primarily based on a open source project called Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is a thing that's managed like a lot of hardware resources, and it determines which job or which deployments should run on which machine, which GPU, at what time, and how would you kind of like route the networking traffic across all those hardware. So our product, which is CentML platform, where as an ML developer or researchers, like the users, they can just like log on to, click a few buttons, and just like let the model to be deployed or let the model to be trained without actually having to worry about where the model is running. Kubernetes is like behind the thing what actually makes all those things kind of like happen. So that's the where we are like adopter of an open source project. And then the final piece is that once you want to train a model or deploy a model, you might be wondering which GPU is the best for you, because top of line flagship GPUs often requires reservation, and you wouldn't be able to get access to them without reservation. But then without a reservation, you also wouldn't be able to measure like, okay, like if I move on to a 2x more expensive GPU, am I gonna get 2x more better performance? So this is the final piece where we are also like a builder and maintainer of open source project called DeepView. So DeepView, like when the user fed a model to it, it would tells you how far it's going to run on a particular GPU and the number of that GPU without you actually having to have physical access to that GPU yourself. So yeah, so that's kind of like a whole spectrum of the project that we're working on, and how we are, like adopter of open source projects, builder of open source project, as well as contributor of open source project. I hope that makes sense from a high level.
No, that's actually fantastic, because I think a lot of people, when they are thinking about these models, obviously they're trying to figure out even where to start. And I think in this case, the infrastructure you're providing obviously is helping tremendously. I was going to ask you, out of curiosity, as we're seeing more models, we're potentially seeing prices get cheaper in the future. A product like CentML, how does that help a company if they have a platform like yours?
So I mean, like maybe kind of put into like a very concrete example. So if I were a bank and then I want to, run like a fraud detection algorithm using some type of deep learning based methods, I probably wouldn't be very comfortable with sending customer, credit card information to OpenAI, right? Like that's probably against my privacy policy. So what I would do is that I would, grab open source model from somewhere, and then maybe I would even like fine tune the model a little bit on the data that I have privately, and then I would find somewhere to deploy those model and after the model is deployed, I would like plug the endpoints back into my, bank, cell phone app or something like that. So like we are essentially kind of the tool, the infrastructure that the bank would use when they want to deploy this model. So back to your earlier question. So what has been kind of becoming cheaper and cheaper are usually serverless endpoints, which are more like kind of like an OpenAI scenario where like you are sending like your data directly to OpenAI and then let the OpenAI model do whatever they want to do and then give you like a response back. Like that wouldn't be very applicable like in kind of this type of like very privacy sensitive situation. So that's one part of it. And then the other part is that at the same time, we are also like making the model to be more and more optimized to run. And then as more hardware comes out, like the older hardware is going to get cheaper. And then, we're also part of the motion where we try to kind of make the model to be cheaper and more accessible for people. So as a matter of fact, that's actually like part of our vision statement, which is we want to make ML models so accessible that like a regular Joe, they can develop them, train them, fine tune them, deploy them without like breaking their bank.
That's interesting. I like that. I mean, obviously, that's we're going to see more proliferation, and that does make sense. I was going to ask you to touch on something when it comes to open source. Obviously, when it comes to some of the security components, and traditionally, the companies weren't super fond of open source for some reasons. They thought closed potentially meant more secure. I don't know if that's true or not, but there's some assumptions there. When it comes to security and it comes to open source AI, can you talk a little bit about your thoughts there? And yeah, that'd be great.
So I think open source, closed source doesn't necessarily mean more mature. So I think a very common usage pattern of open source software is that you are using them as a tool to build other things. And those tools themselves, like all the source code you have access to, so you will know exactly what they're doing. Security is usually a question of when you are building the other things, like have you screwed up? so if you think about it in this way, right, then closed source software would give you more chill in the sense that you don't know what they're doing behind the scene, right? Like if open source project has a security flaw, you could submit a fix to fix it. You could also not do that, right? You could also build in a prevention mechanism in the stuff that you are building using the open source software as a tool, as a library, for example. But then if you're building something using all closed source software, even if it had a security flaw, you wouldn't be able to know about them, right? So like whenever there's a security breach happens, you will be like wait a second, right? Like this is not the behavior that I was expecting the closed source tool I was using to behave. So I mean from my point of view, like if anything, like open source gave more control to you so that like if like there's a security breach, like you have no excuse, right? It's like you who screwed up. It's not somebody else who screwed up. From a privacy, so that's kind of a security part of it. Privacy is a different concern. Or not a different concern, but like a different aspect, which is I want my data to be exactly located where and to be exactly used in what ways. So that's what privacy is about. So closed source AI, like OpenAI, right? So like if you want to build a, say like a, I mean, for example, like the fraud detection app that I was mentioning earlier, if you want to build a fraud detection app using OpenAI's API, like what's going to happen is that someone make a transaction, credit card transaction, at like a certain time and like a certain place, and like where this transaction happens and how much the amount is and what time it is. Those information, they are going to be like formatted into like what we call like a prompt, and then the bank is going to send that prompt to like essentially OpenAI's model endpoints. Now, as a user, as a, you know, like a, what's the word, like a account holder of that bank, are you comfortable with like OpenAI know where you purchased, you know, gas, right? Like which gas station is your favorite, right? Like, are you comfortable with OpenAI getting that kind of like information? Like, I don't know. I mean, like some people might be okay with, a lot of people probably will not be. And an open source alternative way to that is, instead of sending like all those credit card information to some third party, the bank deploy the model themselves, and then the bank send the credit card information to the model that themselves deploy, so that the, like, you know, all the credit card information, they are like entirely within kind of the data parameter, if you will, of the bank. So yeah. So I mean, I hope that makes sense. So like privacy concern and then the security concern, they are two different type of issues, but then like in both cases, like in my view, open source would be like a more reasonable and like a more scalable approach.
No, absolutely. I mean, that does make sense, and I think the explanation was fantastic. And Shang, I wanted to thank you for coming on the show. I know you got to probably get back to running the business and doing what you do, and I thank you for taking the time and giving us some great insights, not only to the open source ecosystem, but also what CentML is doing. If somebody's going to want to follow up and ask you maybe something about what you've referred to on this show, what's a good way of connecting with you?
I have my LinkedIn profile. Feel free to send in like a LinkedIn connects. So just search Shang. So my first name Shang, Shang, and then my last name Wang, Wang, on LinkedIn, and then maybe just add like CentML, you know, behind it, so that like LinkedIn search algorithm doesn't screw it up. CentML is spelled as CENTML. So Cent is the, like the dollar and cents, and then ML is stands for machine learning, so that would be one way. And then the other way is to reach out to me by email. So my email address is my first name Shang, Shang, W, which is the initial of my last name, at centml.ai. AI stands for, you know, artificial intelligence.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate that. We'll make sure to put those in the show notes. Again, thanks for coming on. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks again for having me, and I hope my insights are helpful.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think Shang talked to us about open source AI, and actually we kind of talked a little bit about how it's growing and kind of the importance of the whole ecosystem to where we've gotten to this point and potentially where we're going. And we also talked about CentML and where they fit within the ecosystem. I think Shang did a great job of talking about how the product is instrumental in the process. And I think if you guys have any questions, please reach out to him. He sounds like he will definitely be able to help you. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.